It looks like this, matches that curve pretty well. And over here, we're looking at getting up towards 3 degrees Celsius, upwards to 5.5, 6 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the business as usual here ends up, I don't know, 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. So we can actually take those different projections and say, well, this is what we expect. And the interesting thing is we can now take these kinds of things and put them into models and try to say, well, how does this affect rainfall? How does this affect other things? Because temperature is not going to be the same every place. Some places are going to get warm more than other places. Some places are going to get drier. Some places are going to get wetter. So we can now put this into models and try to figure that out. Well, let's look at a couple of those. Localized heat. The heating isn't going to be the same everywhere. It's not everybody's going to have the same exact thing. It's going to change. But let's look at one of the ways of looking at localized heat is we already now have something National Weather Service puts out called a heat index. That's based on temperature and humidity. This one is based on it's WBGT, which is wet bulb globe temperature, which is like that, except it also adds in how much sunshine, direct sunshine you're getting, and how much wind you have. Both of those have some effect on how hot you feel if you're outside. The a little hard to see, it's not at the bottom. The yellow you see, the yellow dots you're seeing here, are locations where in mid-century, we expect to have this temperature, which is, you really shouldn't be outside in at all. Even a person who's healthy is risking, in a short period of time, is risking health issues by being outside. And we expect all these yellow dots here are places where there will be at least 140 days, where sometime during the day, you're going to be in this condition. That's like 4 months plus that you're going to have sometime during the day when you're not going to be able to be outside. And there's a lot of this in Africa. There's a lot across India, especially. Over where we are, you can see that there's some in southern Texas and along the coast here. But the interesting one is this purple here in Florida and coming up into the southeast. That doesn't look as bad as down here, but actually what we're talking about is having maybe 2 to 2.5 months, maybe 70, 80 days, 2 to 2.5 months, where sometime during the day in the southeast U.S., sometime during the day, it's going to be dangerous to be outside. So this is a serious concern. We talked about sea level rise, at least a foot. We expect it's going to be more than that by the end of the century. The maximum is forecast as 6 feet. We probably won't see that, but 2 to 3 feet wouldn't be surprising, and that's in addition to this 8 to 9 inches we've already had. We expect hurricanes to have stronger winds in them. We expect them to carry more rain. We're not sure they're going to be more frequent. That's one we're still arguing about, but we do think hurricanes are going to be stronger, and they're going to have more rain in them. Droughts and heat waves I talked about separately before. But there was an article in the Post last week that was really interesting because it talked about the fact that they have discovered that in the past, droughts were almost always associated with rainfall patterns. You went through a period of not having as much rain, you had a drought. That makes perfect sense. What they're finding now is a lot of the cause of drought is not the lack of rainfall, but heat. Because hot air evaporates water. And so now we're in situations where we might not have had a drought before we were getting enough rain, but because there's so much heat and it's evaporating that water that it's creating droughts. So the heat is starting to create droughts. So those two play hand in hand now, and that's a change from the past. Wildfires, we expect before too long, mid-century to towards the end of the century, there will probably double the area affected by wildfires any given year. Precipitation, we had talked about more intense storms, but in general, there'll probably be precipitation patterns around the world, and these aren't dramatic, but they are expected to happen. And this is somebody's model of what they think is going to happen. The one on the left here is 2 degrees warming Celsius. The one on the right is 4. We probably see something in between these two maybe. But I like looking at the one on the right because everything's darker and easier to see. But you can see the tendencies of drier climate in the southwest U.S., but actually perhaps a little bit more rain in the rest of the country. The interesting things we're seeing over here is being dry in the Mediterranean area. Spain, Italy, Northern Africa, significantly drier, more arid than they are now. Some dryness in the western part of Australia. And then interesting here across Africa and across the Mideast, a significant increase in the amount of rain there. So this is just something that putting this information into the models we've come up with to see what we think is going to happen. Growing seasons, I mentioned earlier, are lengthening. That process is going to continue. We expect the Arctic to be ice-free in the summer by 2050, by mid-century. So I want to talk now about taking action. And here again, I have to talk a little bit about that before I actually get into it because it's complicated. When we talk looking forward to what do we do about this situation, we have 2 arguments going on in the community. One of them is what we call doomism versus cautious optimism. There are doomists who say there's nothing we can do about this. It's too far gone and it's just going to create a mess. And some will say it's the end of the Homo sapiens. Some will say it's the end of society as we know it. Some don't tell you what it is. It's just going to be awful. But that's what the doomists are saying. It's just going to be awful. And the people who counteract that are what are called cautious optimists. And they will tell you, we can do something about this. It doesn't have to be that bad. It doesn't have to be awful. We can do something about this. But they always have 2 caveats when they say that. The first thing is, it's not going back to the way it was. That it's going to be hotter, and some of these things are going to be in place, and we've got to learn to deal with them. So don't expect we're going to go back to 1950 or 1940 or something like that. It's going to be warmer. And the second caveat is the tough one. We have to do something now about it, and we have to take vigorous action now. We've been kicking the can down the road for decades, knowing that there's a problem and not done anything about it. We can't do that any longer. We've reached the point where if we wait much longer, it is going to get bad. So we got to do something now. So that's one of the arguments we have. The other argument has to do with structural change versus individual responsibility. And people like to argue about, well, the real problem is what people are doing, and people need to change their ways, and then everything will be fine. And other people will say, well, that's not really the problem. The problem is what we have is built in to our economy and our political way of doing things and so on. And we've got to fix that. And the truth is they're both important. Most people will say we really can't do this on an individual basis. As much as we'd like to, we can't get there. We need structural change. But we shouldn't be doing structural change and at the same time having individuals do things that are counteractive, counterproductive to what we're trying to do there. So we really need personal change, but we also need structural change in the way things are done. So I want to talk a little bit about structural change and give an example. Now, this is just an example, and I'm giving this for purposes of showing an example. There was something called the Inflation Reduction Act. You may remember that. It was passed in August of 2002. And it was as a result of or in response to a spike in inflation that occurred in the spring of 2002. 2022, I'm sorry. Thank you. 2022. This is just a couple years ago, yeah. So the curious part about this, to me, as I read through the Inflation Reduction Act, is there didn't seem to be that much in it to reduce inflation. Most of it had to do with environmental things and climate change. And I think it got the name Inflation Reduction Act because everybody's worried about inflation. If you gave it that name, they'd want to pass this. But that's not largely what it was about. but it's expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so I want to talk about that act and how it works or doesn't. So this is a plot of our greenhouse gas emissions in this country. This is in what we call gigatons of CO2. And it's hard to see. This is 1990. You can't see it down at the bottom. This is 1990. This is 2005. And this is now. And the interesting thing is, since 2005, we've actually reduced, in this country, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, which is pretty good. So what else went along with this? Well, this is 2015, and we had something called the Paris Agreement. All the countries got together and said, we really need to take action to do something. And they all agreed, well, we'll do this. And I think the countries committed themselves to taking action. And they really committed themselves to reducing greenhouse gas amounts. They didn't say how they were going to do it. They just committed themselves to reducing it. And at the time, the Obama administration said, well, here's our goal. And they drew a line and, we're going to reduce by so much. And it was aspirational. It wasn't policy. It wasn't law. It was just, this is what we think we need to do. So we'll pursue this and see if we can get there. When the Obama administration left office and the Trump administration came in, the Trump administration first got rid of the Paris Agreement. We got out of the Paris Agreement, so we no longer had that commitment. And they also did some things, whatever they could do in terms of policy to get rid of some of the things that Obama had done in terms of policy. Not laws, just policy that a president can do. Well, they kind of reversed a lot of that. Then Biden got elected, and he put us back in the Paris Agreement again. So we got this back and forth thing with the Paris Agreement, but understand the Paris Agreement is just saying we're going to do something. That's all it is. But the Biden administration was responsible for the Inflation Reduction Act. And like I said, it did a lot with greenhouse gases. Well, when the Biden administration went back into the Paris Agreement, they set a target too. Now, again, this is not law. This is hope. Aspirational, but this is their target. And what they said was by 2030, you can't see it here, but I'm sorry, back up. 2030, which is this line right here, they wanted to be down to half of what we were in 2005. Okay, that was their goal. And then from that point, they wanted to be net zero by, this is 2050, this is mid-century. So that was their, but again, that's a target. That's just, this is what we want to do. But when they put the Inflation Reduction Act together, it ended up looking like this. And the reason I know this is because somebody actually did a study of the policies that were in place with Biden and what they expected. And what you see is it would drop down here is 2030. He wasn't going to make his own target. He'd be above that. But it is a significant change, a significant drop, but it would not make his target. And the reason it flattens out going this way is at that point you would have to pass new laws and do new things. But this at least got us to 2030. The same person who did this analysis also did an analysis for what Donald Trump said he was going to do if he became president. And that looks like this. Because he said he wanted to get rid of the Inflation Reduction Act and some other things. So I'm putting this up not to be judgmental or as a political statement or anything like that. I'm putting this up to try to illustrate what we mean by structural change. Now, what we mean when passing laws and the effect we have when we do that. And you can see it's a significant difference in terms of what we're doing structurally in this country. And I will also tell you that some of these structural things are tied into personal things. For example, there's things in here, if you buy an electric car, you get a tax credit. Well, that's a personal thing, buying an electric car, but it's tied into this structural thing. So they're not completely independent. Some of the structural things encourage personal things. So anyhow, this is just to give you an idea of what we mean when we say structural change and the difference it might make. This is, like I said, this is not meant to be political or judgmental. This is just a way to look at it. So that's the structural part. Let's take a few minutes to talk about personal things you can do. One of the things I always tell people, the starting point is you need to become a vocal and voting advocate for climate change. You need to be talking with your friends, your family, people you know, about what the problem is and how important it is that we do something about it. And it's good to vote that way too. What we found out is that there are a lot of people who are concerned about climate change, but when the time comes to vote, climate change is like fourth or fifth on their list of issues. And so that doesn't really come into play. And we need to get to the point where if you're concerned about climate change, then that needs to come into play on how you vote. Other things you can do. This is the top of this list here are two things that when you ask the public and you ask the experts, they give you the same answer. Install solar, go hybrid or electric with your automobile. And you may ask the question, how do you do that? I mean, I have my own house and it's got solar on it, but you may not have your own house and so on. But we can do these things institutionally. Our church is now working on putting solar on the roof of the church. And the reason is some of us said, we've got this great big space up there. We're not doing anything with it except keeping rain off of us. Why don't we put solar up there? We can use it to power the church and save money and save that emission of gas. So we're in the process of doing that. And you can do that on an institutional basis. I don't know what's going on here at Asbury. But if a bunch of people, if nothing is going on, a bunch of people got together, you might be able to encourage the powers that be that it's time to start looking at where you can put solar and how you make that work. And with hybrid and electric, that's another thing that it's not real obvious how to do. I noticed coming in tonight, there's a place out there where you can charge a car. I also noticed there's two cars plugged in. So if I wanted to plug my Tesla in, I couldn't do it. We would need to be ahead on the infrastructure. Not people looking at it saying, I'd like to get a hybrid, but I'm not sure how I'd plug it in because the things are busy all the time and they're not and so on. What you really need to do is get the infrastructure ahead so people are looking at it saying, hey, if I had a hybrid, I could plug it in over there because there's vacant spots out there available and have those spots around. So that's one way institutionally in a place like this, you can encourage that type of thing. Walk, bike, carpool, take mass transit. We all know that. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to do a place like this. It's very hard to do most places. This country is built around having automobiles. The assumption is people have automobiles almost everywhere, except some big cities. So that's hard to do. But to the extent you can do it, you ought to try. Reducing air travel kind of fits into the same situation. Reduce consumption of meat. I talked about the agriculture, the livestock effects. And we're not saying everybody has to become a vegetarian. If you just ate half as much beef, if everybody in this country ate half as much beef as they eat today, it would make a huge difference in our methane emissions. Simple things like, raise and lower your thermostat. This is not hard. 1 or 2 degrees, we have shorts and t-shirts we can wear in the summer. We have sweaters we can wear in the winter. A few degrees on how you set your thermostat makes a difference. It really does. Turn off things when you're not using them. How many people turn on their TV when they get up in the morning, they turn it off and they go to bed at night, but they only watch it 2 or 3 hours during the day and it's on the rest of the time. If you're not using something as burning electricity, you ought to turn it off. This is an interesting one, avoid cryptocurrency. I can't imagine that a lot of you are engaged in using cryptocurrency. I haven't figured out yet why we need cryptocurrency. It seems like a hobby and an investment thing and so on, but I'm not sure it benefits society or our economy much at all, to be perfectly honest. What I can tell you is it is an energy hog. It's a very inefficient energy hog. And we'd be better off without it. But the best we can do, at least on our part, is avoid it. And then down at the bottom, I have reduce, reuse, recycle. And reduce, reuse, I can tell you, you can really reduce your footprint by reducing the number of things you buy. There's a chain behind it that gets it to the store and you get it and so on, reducing the number of things you buy. Or if you have to buy something you can reuse so you don't have to buy another one. And that again, and that does reduce your footprint. But the reason I put this one at the bottom is because recycle. Don't get me wrong. recycling is very good for the environment. It really is. But it has almost no impact at all on climate change. Almost none whatsoever. And the reason I like to put it at the bottom, because there's an awful lot of people, if you say we have a problem with climate change, what do you think you can do? Then they say, well, I'm already doing it. I'm recycling. I do all my recycling. And I can tell you, my wife will tell you, I'm a recycling Nazi. I drive her and everybody else I'm around nuts with recycling. I really believe in it, but I can tell you it's not going to help climate change. So don't think, keep recycling, but don't think that you're doing your part for climate change because you're recycling. Well, I've said a lot of things here, some of them probably a little bit provocative, so I think what we need to do is move on to give you a chance to say something, ask questions, or discuss something and so on. Thank you very much for the
Raise your hand, please, if you have a question.
They're going to bring a microphone around to you. I would just as soon point to you, but I'm not going to do that. I'll let them bring a microphone. We have, yeah, okay. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. It's hard not to get into politics.
Yes.
But how much harm can be caused in 4 years?
How much harm can be caused to employers? Harm by doing what? How much HARM harm can be caused to employers? Oh, how in 4 years? It's not entirely clear. And the reason I say that is this analysis was done assuming that these things are going to happen. And we're not sure how much is going to change because the IRA is a law. And so the law has to be changed, and that takes time. And there are things in the IRA that they may not want to change. For example, a majority of the funding on projects out in the country from the IRA are actually in Republican areas. So they may not want them to change it. So I can't say that. And that's what makes it so difficult and makes all this so hard to figure out is because of that very thing. You know, you can't just say, well, this is what's going to happen because we don't know. It may not be as bad as I showed up here. That was analysis saying if he can do everything he says he wants to do. But he may, number one, not be able to, and he may, number two, change his mind, or other people may change his mind. And that's politics. Yes, sir.
It's a similar question. One of the headlines today was on a meeting going on between many different nations here, all of them seeming to just take what I would call an indeterminate pause on agreeing with their past agreements.
Yeah, let me comment on that. I take the Post, Washington Post, and I do it the old-fashioned way. I go out and pick it up at my driveway every morning. And last week, there were 3 stories on climate change. One of the things I talked about was from one of those stories. Today, there was another story. And the whole point of that story was that nations are saying, this is what we're going to do and making commitments, and they're not following through. And that was the point of that story. And that's a true thing. And the United States is one of them. And regarding your comment, it's about where we are today, not where we're going to be the next 4 years. Okay? This country is producing more oil now than we ever have in the past and than any other country has ever had in the past. Now, after 4 years of the Biden administration, this is not a cut and dried simple thing. Yes, sir. Yeah, ma'am.
Kind of on the same line, the global climate meeting that is happening right now.
Yes.
This morning, I heard that there's a lot of disarray because nobody knows what the United States has kind of been one of the mainstays of having countries do something and set goals. And now they're going to be looking to China. So what is China doing for this?
Well, China is the biggest emitter in the world by a significant amount. We are the second, but China's like 2.5 times us. Okay. China is actually doing things, but it's very difficult for them because they've got a long history of at the same time they're trying to do good things, they're building coal power plants. So they're working across purposes. Okay. I'm not counting on a lot of help from China. I will say that the meeting that's going on this year, the climate meeting, which is called COP29, the climate meeting is they cycle back and forth between commitments of the nations to make changes in what they're doing one year, and the next year they look at how can we help third world countries deal with climate change, and this is a third world year. So the focus is not going to be on all the nations committing to reducing greenhouse gases this year. The focus is going to be on nations committing to help nations, third world nations that need help deal with climate change problems. So that's what this is about. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Many years ago, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, Al Gore wrote An Inconvenient Truth. And I just wonder what happened to him. I know this is an aside, but where is he? When we began to be frightened about climate change as a nation, nobody mentioned him, and he didn't come out publicly. What's he doing?
I don't know, to be honest with you. Al Gore,
Al Gore.
did a lot. That was a long time ago. I think he's a very old man. And some of us old guys don't come out and talk a lot. So that would be my guess, is he may be at the point where he's just beyond politics. I don't know. But that's a good question, because I read that too. And he was one of the first people to really stick his neck out and say, we have a problem. And I had a lot of respect for that. So I don't know where we are now. Over here.
Before I retired and came here, I used to work in fire.
It's okay.
Okay. I used to work in fire research, doing modeling and things like that. One of the things we worried about was soot, which affected very strongly the radiative balance that affected the growth and decay of fires. And I was wondering, you've only talked about greenhouse gases. What role do aerosols of one kind or another play in the atmospheric balance?
Very interesting question. Aerosols. Aerosols are particles that are up in the air, and he's particularly talking about soot. And soot does stay up in the air. It tends to block sunlight, so it has a cooling effect. Unfortunately, when it settles down on snow, it turns the snow dark, and it has a warming effect because no longer no reflect. So it goes both ways. But one of the really interesting things about aerosols in general is something that happened last year, and that is we've been putting up for forever with ships at sea, cargo ships, using diesel fuel that had a lot of gave off a lot of pollutants, and we passed a law last year internationally to say we got to stop doing this. And last year they cleaned up the fuel that was being used by these ships. And it really helped something, because what was coming out was sulfur dioxide was the problem, was coming out. And it affects people's health. And there were a lot of people in this world who were being impacted negatively by sulfur dioxide. And some people were even estimating deaths in the hundreds of thousands because of problems with their breathing from sulfur dioxide. We kind of got rid of that problem because it's gone. The thing is, when we did that, sulfur dioxide reflects sunlight. So it was cooling the earth. And we actually, last year, for the first year when we didn't have sulfur dioxide up there, there was a noticeable, measurable effect on the temperature last year without the sulfur dioxide. So soot goes both ways. Yes, sir.
My first job out of college was a year at Emmons and Scott. We had 12 consecutive days where it never got above 100 below zero. I saw a thing recently that in 2015 that at Pole there was a temperature, a record high of 15 degrees Fahrenheit, not, above freezing, but still pretty damn warm. That's just scary as hell to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things we have seen is extreme temperatures. It's not like the temperature's gone up 1.4 degrees Celsius, which is about 2.5, 3 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it's the same everywhere. That's not what's happening. You know, we're seeing spikes. And part of the problem we're having is that as the temperatures change, the weather patterns change. And that's causing a lot of these things. It's not just the temperature going up. The temperatures, and I didn't talk about that, but that's one of the impacts we're having is, and it's very hard to figure out what's happening. But one of the things that's happening is the weather patterns are changing because the temperature's changing. So we end up with periods, long periods of dry, long periods of wet, long periods of hot, and so on that we didn't have before. Understand, most of these things have happened in the past. They're just worse now because of this. And there is a whole science in climate science called attribution science, which is attempting to look at these situations and say, how much is this more likely due to climate change? How much is it worse due to climate change, and so on, because these things happened before. Is it more likely now than it was before? Is it worse now than it was before? And try to get that attribution, because it's easy enough to say, we've always had floods, we've always had hurricanes, what's the big deal? And we're trying to suss out the difference between what they're doing now and what they were like before.
Okay, this is the last question over here. Over there.
Yes, sir.
We came from Asheville, and I read that Helene took up something like 5 trillion gallons of water, which I calculated as something like 4 squares of water, but each side was 10 miles.
Mm-hmm.
So are we likely to see more Helenes?
Yes, we are. But understand, one of the things about Helene and Asheville had to do, it wasn't just, there was a lot of water in it, but a lot of it had to do with the terrain. When you push air up a mountain, you cool it, and that makes the water condense out of it. And so we tend to get more in that situation. And this is another one of those cases where we think this was worse because of climate change. But there are things that would have happened anyway. If we would have had a lot of rain, it was just worse. And that's pretty typical of most of the things we're seeing. They're either worse or they're more likely to happen. They happen more often or something like that. But they're not things that necessarily happened before. I used to have 70 people working for me in Asheville, and at the Climate Center. Yeah, except I was running the Air Force Climate Center, so we had 70 people down there associated with that. So I have a soft spot in my heart for Asheville. It's a lovely area, and it just kills me to see what happened to it.
Okay,
Thank
thank you very much, Judge.
Yeah.